Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss The Music of Christendom by Susan Treacy. We are on chapter 12, The Red Priest, Antonio Vivaldi. And I'll let you come to his defense, but I'm rather scandalized by the fact that he was ordained, and then after a year, he no longer celebrates Mass because of asthma and so on, but he directs a choir, and he writes, Four Seasons, all these wonderful things. But, you can say Mass with asthma. I mean, it's not that, to me, you're a priest. That's your primary task, You write good music. That's nice.
Well, you're not the only one. You aren't the only one scandalized. He lost one of his aristocratic benefactors for the same reason. He was scandalized that Vivaldi wasn't saying Mass. I don't remember which one. And all we have for the explanation is that that first year of saying Mass, 3 times he had to leave the altar in the middle of Mass because of this constriction he was feeling in his chest. So I don't know who his superiors were, but, it's kind of a mystery. I don't know, but...
Oh, well, I've got my own faults and sins. I'm not going to stand in judgment of him, but, well, I guess I just did, but...
Well, when we was first hired at this orphanage for girls, he was only hired as a violin teacher, which... he did go on, though, to conduct things and so on and travel. So I don't know, but but thank God he did go as a violin teacher to this orphanage for girls, because the music that came out of that place, and how beautiful when you hear these recordings of Vivaldi's music and realize that these orphaned girls, and some of them lived there till they were into advanced age, because if they became virtuoso musicians, they just stayed. Other people learned trades and left the institution, but the women who became highly proficient, they stayed there for the rest of their lives. And I don't know, I think there's something beautiful about the whole thing. The sick priests, the orphaned girls, it's a ship of misfits producing all this beauty together. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing that can happen. People have more musical ability than one would think. I think Thomas is here as our technical man. He was at Casa Balthasar. There were never more than 8 or 10 or maybe 12 or 14 young men at Casa Balthasar, but Father Servet, who was the rector there, he had concerts going on and choirs and plays being put on. It's amazing what can be done if you come together and organize and practice, Well, I think what the Jesuits did with the Guarani, in the Reducciones in Paraguay. I mean, they had Palestrina being played. They were making violins and selling them back to Europe. Phenomenal what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph, you remember at Ave Maria, when I introduced some chant to the Mass, just a simple chant, we sounded like a choir. It was amazing how good that was.
Yep.
And he was also free to experiment, which is why he was so innovative with the concertos and everything, because he was free to experiment. He wasn't as beholden to certain benefactors or whatever who wanted music in a certain style. He was allowed to experiment, and we have the legacy of his music as a result.
Yeah, it's amazing as we go through this book to see all these different people in different style and different variations on things and development, and it's almost like an infinite variety of beauty that you can have.
And I just love it because this is it's really filled in. I just had the rough dot to dot sketch outline of musical history, and this has really fleshed it out for me. So I think this is just a great introduction for people that don't know much about the history of music.
Well, and here's a little value for me is that I don't usually listen to radio when I'm driving. Once in a while I do, and we have a station called KDFC out here in the Bay Area, which is the classical station. And so I'll put that thing on, and I mean, almost every one of the names that they mention are in this book. Ravel, I get that, whatever it may be. So she really has kind of covered the fundamental members of the constellation of music.
Yes.
Shall we go
to that remark, it's amazing that, so you're listening to this music on the radio, this is what's been preserved. All of these composers, so much of their works we no longer have. And it's amazing that in the case of Johann Sebastian Bach, the next chapter, that his music was actually completely forgotten until it was rediscovered, 100 years later by Felix Mendelssohn. We listen to Bach and we just are astonished, aren't we? Like, how could his music just have been forgotten?
Yeah,
it was considered out of fashion.
I wrote in the margin when it talks about that GMH for Gerard Manley Hopkins. Because again, Hopkins's poetry was completely misunderstood by his contemporaries and was just not published for that reason. And then sort of 30 years after his death, the Robert Bridges publishes the volume of his poetry, and all of a sudden he's this great modern poet, 30 years after he's dead. So, again, there's something, it's the proof of timelessness. If what you've done is relevant, long after you've died.
But I mean, how could someone listen to Bach and say no? I mean,
Well, how does she explain it? That his music sort of went out of vogue, and that does happen. People's what they want to hear, their tastes change, and they move on. And we need to give Felix Mendelssohn a lot of credit for revivifying his Saint Matthew Passion.
But I mean,
which, by the way, St. Matthew's Passion is how Maria von Trapp converted to the Catholic faith. She was a musician, and she would go to the Easter service at the church in Salzburg, and or Vienna, wherever she was living at that time, just to listen to the music. And she was there on an Easter Sunday. They were playing parts of St. Matthew's Passion, or whatever it was during Holy Week. They were playing parts of St. Matthew's Passion. That's the only reason why she was in the church. But that particular day, the priest had true zeal. And whatever it was he said just cut her to the quick. And she actually went to the man and said, "Do you really believe everything you just said?" And he said, "Don't you?" and he made an appointment to see her later, and she went, and the rest is history, as they say.
Oh. Actually, it's parallel. If you have the chance to read a wonderful poem by Siegfried Sassoon called Sheldonian Soliloquy, and this was soon after World War I, in the 1920s. Sassoon is certainly not a Christian, but there's this wonderful poem about his attending a performance of Bach's B minor Mass. And not only is it a beautiful poem, but it's quite clear the transcendence of the beauty is lifting him up in some form of inarticulate prayer. So you can almost see, if you like, the embryo of his future conversion in this impact that this religious musical experience is having on him.
Well, I've got two Bach stories. One, I was giving a 30-day retreat in Rome to the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. And while I was there, it was the month of July or August, in the Jesuit church in Rome, they had a Bach festival where every night they played some of his organ music. the idea was to play his entire organ music corpus in 30 evenings, So I went down there every night, and I would walk up the side aisle and back and forth, and playing it in a church and hearing that organ and the resonance. And they organized it every night so that the simple things were beginning, and then they got more complex, and the final thing was a grand finale. But I thought, Vivian, you said, they didn't suit their taste. That's like saying music doesn't suit your taste. This is just music, My second story, you'll recognize this, Joseph. Ave Maria, my little cabana was across the pool from a room that had a piano in it. And there was a student there, Lucia Jager, who played the piano. And I would see her playing through my window and through the glass doors. So I would pour myself a glass of wine and go and quietly open the door and just sit there and listen to her play. And so one night I did this, and I noticed that she's at the piano and she's turning the pages backwards, And when she finishes, I said, Lucy, what are you doing? She said, I'm playing Bach backwards because I'm learning sight reading, and it's too easy if I go forwards. But Bach backwards sounded pretty good. He's so mathematical. The harmonies intertwined so beautifully that backwards or forwards, it was glorious.
Wow. Wow.
Well, one final story is that as a novice, Father Carol Laubacher was our choir director, and he put in a new organ. And during communion in the old Mass, he would play these Bach fugues. And nothing is more meditative than this interplay of the different voices after communion. It was glorious.
Well, we also, I would be remiss, I would feel, if I didn't point out that, with Bach here, we're going to enter now a period where we're not simply dealing with Catholic musicians, right? Bach
That's right.
is Lutheran, Mendelssohn is a Jew, Handel is when he goes to England anyway, he becomes Church of England, and so this universality of beauty, and that somehow, even though we're dealing with religious differences, this universality transcends that, but in a very interesting way is wedded to Christian truth, right? Is wedded to Orthodox Catholicism,
Yeah. Well,
even when the people playing it, the people writing it, the people listening to it are of varying degrees of relationship to the origin of that. Here it still is flowering. And Maria von Trapp, when she walked into that church, she was a communist, an atheistic communist. So it should be a very hopeful thing to us, actually.
Yeah,
that beauty and truth still communicate in a universal way.
The one thing I would say is that I'm tempted to quote Chesterton when he says that the modern world is living off its Catholic capital. And these composers might be Lutherans or Anglicans or what have you, but they're living on the heritage, the Catholic capital, the foundations that have been laid for centuries. And they're not making up new rules. They're playing by the same Catholic rules. It's just that in their, if you like, private lives, they are no longer practicing the Catholic faith.
Well, I wouldn't call them Catholic rules. If they're rules of music, they're rules of music simply, and they're part of I grant you, they're part of our patrimony. But I would hate to be.
I'll rephrase that. Part of the Catholic patrimony, part of what the Catholic Church has given. Obviously, mathematical rules aren't Catholic per se, right?
Yeah, but there's an in between there. It arose in a Catholic context. And when you think of, what Catholicism is, it's the Katholon according to the whole, it's the symphony, there's something co-natural between harmony, symphony, music, and Catholic truth.
Well, doesn't Benedict Ratzinger say something like that? It might have been, I don't know if it was in the Regensburg speech or one of his books about how, the great things of Western civilization, they weren't simply coincident with Christianity, that this is not an accident, that these things occurred when they did, and flowered in Christian culture the way they did. And yet we do have to be careful about claiming it and holding on to it as if it belongs only to us. But it isn't simply an accident that these things grew up together, right?
Right. And even these, these non-Catholic Christian composers, even some of the Jewish ones, what do? They write a requiem or a mass, or even some modern composers they're setting Latin melodies, into some kind of new arrangement. It's amazing how.
Well, again, the irony is that following the abolition, if you like, the banning of the traditional mass in the early 1970s, it was a group of secular scholars that wrote a letter, to the Times saying this is part of the common patrimony of humanity, that the Latin mass, and that it's scandalous that it's the church which is abandoning something which has become a common patrimony of all civilized people.
Are you talking about the letter signed by Agatha Christie?
I am, the so-called Agatha Christie letter, yeah. Well, there are lots of other people signed, and lots of other people that were certainly famous at the time, even if some of them perhaps you have to be an historian of that period to know who they are now.
But I guess Pope Paul VI, the story is, and maybe this is, legendary, I don't know, her name is the one that popped out at him.
I've heard that. I have heard that.
And then when he granted the indult to the English Catholics to continue with the Mass, as before, it was called the Agatha Christie Indult as a result.
Yeah, I had heard that. I have something on page 103 of the Bach chapter.
Very good. All right.
So, it said ultimately it took the 19th century Romantic movement to be the catalyst that would restore Bach's music to its rightful place of honor and put him in the highest echelon of composers. One distinguishing characteristic of the Romantics was their nostalgia for the past. German Romantics in particular were seeking for all that was distinctively German and all that was best in their past. And this, combined with religious revival, led to a renewed focus on Bach as an icon of German Christianity. The one thing I want to say there is that this is what distinguishes, in some sense, German Romanticism from English Romanticism, because the English Romantics shared that great passion for the past. But in the case of the English Romantics, it was a neo-medievalism in the broadest sense, the age of chivalry, the age of knights shining armor, King Arthur, etc. Whereas the German Romanticism would actually decay into German nationalism, and through Nietzsche and then ultimately Hitler become something dangerous.
Well, explain this to me. You got the Renaissance, which is an interest in the past going beyond the medieval period to the classical period. So that's a renaissance, a rebirth of the past. And you got Romanticism, which goes back to the past, whether medieval in Germany or, Chthonic in England or Chthonic in Germany. So what's in between? What's in between the Renaissance and Romanticism?
Well, I think that what's happening, Father, is, what Tolkien says about only God can create, we subcreate, we make things from other things that already exist. When we have a cultural reaction against the zeitgeist, that we tend to play leapfrog. In other words, that when the Renaissance was tired of scholasticism and the whole medieval thing, it rediscovers the pre-Christian classical thing. And when the Romantics become tired and fed up with the whole Enlightenment, empiricist, rationalist thing, they leapfrog over the whole period and rediscover the Middle Ages. So I think it's what I call sort of intellectual leapfrogging. You reject what's been very powerful for the last couple of hundred years by leapfrogging over it to something that preceded it.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Good. Vivian, does that sound good to you?
Yeah, it does.
From Bach to Handel?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's get a handle on Handel.
Yes.
As long as we're not barking up the wrong tree.
Right. Well, and as she explains, he starts out when he goes to England, because he just happened to be the music director for the man who became the King of England. When the House of Hanover began ceding the English throne. And so he ends up there and he tries opera. But interesting, on the bottom of 110, opera, the Londoners aren't so crazy about opera. One reason was they considered it unnatural. And Father, you've made similar remarks before, that you don't care for opera so much because it's sort of an unnatural way to tell a story. These
affectation is part of it. Right? And affectation.
These singing, these pieces which are really to the extreme and so on. So they consider it unnatural. And also the language barrier. They didn't want to listen to music in Italian. And so this led to these development of these oratorios, which is still the voices used in oratorios and the arias and so on are still at a very high operatic level. But they aren't all gooey and all of this, I mean, people are more emotionally under control, and then many of them were written in English. And of course, his greatest of all, Messiah, which I didn't realize until I read this, the role that his friend played in the creation of Messiah, this Jennings, which she describes on 112, that he's describing him as a learned and fervent Christian and a stealth evangelist, that his intention was that Handel's Messiah would in fact be evangelistic in winning people to Christ. I didn't know that. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I've got that highlight. Also, I mean, that you're right, completely agree that they didn't want to listen to the affectation of opera, the artificiality of it, the foreignness of it, and also, as she points out on page 111, there's an element of the anti-Catholicism. The English, by this stage, turn their nose up at those swarthy Southern Europeans and their religion. But also, I loved, again, I love the way she defines these new musical genre in their historical context. So the whole description or definition of oratorio on page 111, and again, the Catholic roots of it. Oratorio is a full-length sacred music drama with soloists, chorus, and orchestra. It differs from opera in that it does not have stage action, sets, or costumes. The musical genre of oratorio has Catholic origins, as it was initially a devotional service with song. This service was begun and promoted in 16th century Rome by St. Philip Neri and his Congregation of the Oratory. When Philip moved from his native Florence to Rome, he brought with him the popular Laude Spirituali, religious songs he had learned from his Dominican friar teachers. It wasn't until between approximately the years 1620 and 1640 that the oratorio evolved from Neri's devotional service, at which simple laude was sung, to an extended musical genre that was more like an opera. So again, in one paragraph, she allows us to understand the whole musical genre, what it is, and its historical context and roots, which I just think is marvelous.
Yes, I didn't know any of that either.
It's also interesting, page 112, they say that Handel's oratorios are not liturgical music, they are Christian entertainment and were often performed during Lent in place of opera. So in other words, in a secular cultural environment, they wouldn't perform opera in Lent. They would perform oratorios instead.
Right, which is beautiful. That the people understood that Lent was a time for greater prayer and devotion. And I too, during Lent, I listened to the suffering Savior sections of Messiah. During Advent, I listened to the coming of the Messiah sections. I mean, I'm very attached to Handel's Messiah. It's yeah.
Onward Oh, go
Can
ahead.
well, I mean, say, unless you have something else, can we move on to chapter 15?
Let's go to Haydn.
Yeah, something I find interesting here. It talks about that Haydn, the composer of the classical era, added many references to the learned or contrapuntal style that had been abandoned by J.S. Bach's sons and their generation. This I find interesting because it does give us an inkling as to why Bach fell out of fashion. In other words, he was very technical, using counterpoint. And basically, there was obviously a fashion after that just to be much more simple, whether it's because they didn't have the talent of Bach or they just wanted to strip it back a bit. But so the classical music is basically rediscovering and then innovating upon this contrapuntal techniques that Bach was using.
I find it I found it intriguing, her use of the expression art conceals art, which I don't think applies just to classical music by any means. Any great art is art that conceals art, meaning true artistic excellence makes the difficulty of what they're doing look easy and graceful, So so that art conceals art, which she mentions here on page 117, I see as being kind of a description of all great art.
Yes, and even beyond art. I remember in a kitchen in Hamburg, Germany, while a woman was making dinner, Captain Manson's wife, and she had a newborn in her arms and a 2-year-old on the floor, and she was mixing this, and cooking that, and adding this, and I said, well, that's like a symphony. But she made it look simple. It's like, no problem with that. I mean, if I try to do that, everything would be on the floor. So yes,
it's certainly true of great athletes also.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Right? They make simple catching these balls from outer space and running and leaping into the air, and classical ballet dancers are some of the most highly trained athletes on the planet. Everything they do is so incredibly hard and takes such incredible strength, and they make it look like just a bunch of pixies.
Yeah, to me, the prime analogy to that for me is figure skating, ice skating.
Yes.
I would imagine trying to throw you up, Vivian, and make it and spin you 3 times and catch you.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, and they just make it look so easy, and that is art concealing art, right? That is a sign of greatness.
It's also maddening when you try and learn some kind of artistic thing. Like I'm trying to learn the banjo now, and for everyone else, it looks so easy. But anyway, so we're actually interested. I'm not sure we could say music is on an upward climb. In a certain sense, it's cumulative. So every time you get something new, you add to what was there before. But I think we're entering a kind of a golden age, so a whole classical period here, where we're going to get this incredible development of the symphony. It really is
right.
Something.
And she calls Haydn the father of the symphony on page 121.
Yeah.
As well as the father of the string quartet. But just the sheer number of instruments. You go from, think of Vivaldi's now, these Baroque quartets and things, or these concertos with still very few instruments in comparison to an entire symphony. Just the sheer complexity of it.
Yeah, I actually highlighted the same passage here on page 121 about, again, it's another example of her contextualizing history in a succinct manner for, dummies like me. So Haydn is the father of the symphony, as you say, Vivian, father of the string quartet, because he developed these genres significantly. But then she, again, contextualized it within the tradition. The symphony, whose remote ancestor was the Italian opera overture, the Sinfonia, became one of the most popular musical genres of the 18th century, as witnessed by 12,350 surviving manuscripts. So presumably 12,350 surviving symphonies,
Right.
So you really get this understanding of an explosion of this new genre, or this development of that earlier genre.
And again, you would have to have a large middle class of people who can fill theaters to put on these huge performances and make it economical. This isn't just, Prince so-and-so of Brandenburg hiring his little quartet of musicians to play background music while he shaves or whatever. I mean, that's this is a whole new ball game, basically.
Well, all progress has trade-offs, and when you think about the fact that they didn't have electric lights, they didn't have newspapers and magazines like we have now, and radio and television, and so if you're near a village or a larger city and you wanted to get together and do social things, well, music was one of them, and so having an opera house or having a concert hall, this is part of community life. But now we still have those, but there's so much competing for them that it's not part of our normal life. Plus the fact it's probably some kind of a sacrilege, but it's easier to listen to symphony while you're driving your car than it is to buy a ticket and go down and get in line and so on.
Right, but I must say the difference between live performance, any live performance, whether it's a play or ballet, or the difference between live performance and a recording are on magnitudes of, I don't even.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the difference between reality and virtual reality.
I guess so, yeah. So this was so interesting how the Lord Nelson Mass got named. Weren't you surprised, Joseph?
I was very surprised at that. Yes, indeed. Again,
that it originally was
the
a
whole
mass.
thing is full of little treasures like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was originally a mass for the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and but because Lord Nelson happened to be entertained when he visited this prince, it got renamed that ever since. Who knew?
Exactly. Who knew?
Yeah.
Here, this chapter ends on a very poignant. The next chapter is Mozart. We should probably wait till next week for that. But the ending of this chapter is very poignant because when Haydn dies, Mozart's Requiem was played at the memorial service, which means Mozart, his student, has already died. Because as we know, Mozart's Requiem was being written as he was dying. And I don't know, I almost had a bit of a tear thinking of the early demise of Mozart and his piece being played at the Mass for his teacher. I don't know, something moving about that.
Yeah. So it's sad, but also sort of providentially beautiful, right?
Yes.
Well, let's resume then with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart next week as we continue discussing the music of Christendom. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.